So I don't see any near-term turnaround. In fact, I see a kind of a slow grind downwards the way Japan did for over a decade. There are some bright spots, but as a percentage of GDP, they're not that large. And so it's difficult to see how China's going to dig itself out of this hole.
On the face of it, China's economy performed well in 2025. Booming exports kept growth on track, while manufacturers moved up the value chain. But investment is headed for its first annual contraction since 1998. Domestic demand is famously sluggish, and new home prices fell further in November, weighed down by a property crisis, which seems never to go away. Andrew Collier, who's a senior fellow at the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government at Harvard Kennedy School, has just come back from a trip to China, and he joins us today to share his experiences with what he's seen on the ground. Andy, welcome. Great to see you.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, this week, Chinese leader Xi Jinping said he expected China's gross domestic product to expand by around 5% this year. Now, we know these forecasts are largely political decisions, but how do you think China will reach this forecast?
Well, as you know, these figures tend to be manipulated, so I don't put much faith in them. Plus, China tends to consider any hole in the ground they fill with concrete as a form of economic growth. So I don't pay as much attention to the GDP figures. The real issue is, as you indicated before, the other statistics in terms of consumption and fixed asset investment, and none of these other indices are looking very healthy right now.
Yeah, a big indicator is retail sales, and growth for retail sales have hit their worst pace outside of the pandemic. There's a lot of talk about kickstarting domestic demand, and the government says much needs to be done to kickstart domestic demand. Everyone's calling for China to kickstart domestic demand. But what is actually going to happen on this, and what do you think can be done to improve domestic consumption?
Well, I'm increasingly skeptical of the official statements and the plans. We just saw the Central Economic Work Conference, and they made noises about increasing consumption. But Xi Jinping's main focus these days is trying to turn China into a great nation with military power and also economic power in key industries, including electronic vehicles and AI and so forth. So in the past, the government has heavily subsidized the EV industry going back a decade, which helped to propel it to significant growth. But there's been no major rebalancing of taking money away from the industrial economy or the state industries to give them in the hands of consumers. So I don't expect a lot of change there. There may be some tax breaks for certain key, as I said, key technologies. But one of the problems there is that the tax breaks are often given by local governments who are running out of money because the property industry they've used as their piggy bank for the last 20 years is running into significant headwinds, and you can't sell land if nobody wants to build buildings. So I'm not even sure the tax breaks are going to necessarily be that effective. Plus, people who don't want to buy anything don't need tax breaks if they're not going to spend the money. So I don't see a lot of change. I think Xi Jinping is doubling down on his technology bets.
You mentioned the property market there. Let's dig down a little bit into that. I mean, it seems still fairly desperate, and it has been now for 4 or 5 years, going on for 5 years. How is this playing out on the ground, given that you've just been there? You know, how does this appear sort of IRL in real life?
Well, the official data says that prices have fallen something like 2%, which is ridiculous. Everybody I talked to was talking about at least 20% in the major cities where they're wealthier, and then anywhere from 30 to 60% declines in other areas of the country. China's got a giant hole in the property sector because they use that to fuel the economy for over 20 years. It was a bubble, a very serious bubble. And now they're running into problems. And I think the leadership's attitude is, well, if we just provide a little bit of fuel to the fire, we'll get people back into the property industry. But that's not happening because most people on the ground are stuck with unsold inventory. There's 760 million square meters of unsold property, which is more than they actually sell in a year. And that number could be too low. So I don't see any near-term turnaround. In fact, I see a kind of a slow grind downwards the way Japan did for over a decade. I'm not optimistic that there's anything that can be done to help that.
I mean, when you're around, traveling around the cities and stuff, I mean, do you see empty properties? Is it that obvious? Is there sort of, or is it mostly sort of in terms of, unfinished projects or things that haven't been sold?
Well, I was in Beijing this trip in Hong Kong, but I have a research assistant in Shenzhen, and I've talked to people, and there's a lot of unsold property. As I just said, 765 million square meters. I saw a lot of that stuff being built 20 years ago, and I was pretty certain that given the locations out in the countryside, there's going to be no demand for a lot of this. But one of my friends is actually the chief financial officer for a large property company in Hong Kong with lots of inventory in China. And he said, well, what we really are concerned about is the speculative investment. So, how much of this stuff is actually just being bought as a flyer on the economy growing, and nobody has a really good handle on that. So you could see lights may come on occasionally in an apartment building, but you're going to see a fair amount of empty stuff. And so that number that we really want to know, we just can't know at this point.
And while you were there, you spoke to the American Chamber of Commerce. What were the main issues that you heard from their membership?
Well, they're very concerned about the future of the Chinese economy because obviously, if you're trying to sell cars or pharmaceuticals or industrial engines, you want to make sure that there's demand. And leaving aside the intense competition with China, if the economy is slowing and fixed asset investment is slowing, then you're not going to get a lot of demand. The second thing is, which is not spoken too widely, but the dinner parties I went to, people talked about their, personal safety. I mean, if Americans are occasionally running into, you could have a business problem, and the next thing you're thrown in jail. So there's a concern about the safety of some of the senior senior people in the business community. And then the geopolitical area is, I mean, everybody knows the issues are not just created by China. Obviously, the Trump trade war is a problem, but that is going to affect what has been fairly healthy exports, which is a third of GDP, 37% last year. So if you're sending goods into China to be refashioned to goods for export, your export markets might collapse in 2026. They're shifting a lot of their exports towards Southeast Asia and Africa and other areas, but that can't replace Europe and the United States if we continue to see opposition in those regions.
Yeah. I mean, these things are all connected, of course, and the fact that exports is such a huge percentage of GDP can't be healthy. And then we're looking at, of course, at unemployment. I think over the years that we've been talking about China, I mean, I remember several decades ago, there was talk about you needed 8% growth every year to keep employment stable. I think those figures are long gone. But how would you describe the employment situation in China right now?
Well, it's interesting. The gig economy has really become a driver of jobs. And some people argue that that's great because obviously it gives you flexibility. And but the problem with that is that the pay is not necessarily very good, particularly for the food delivery. They're making very meager wages for that. And if you run around I was mainly in Beijing, which is a wealthy city, but there's tons of these delivery people constantly running around. And I think a lot of the economy has shifted to that. The problem is that Xi Jinping has an oppositional view about that. He doesn't like the gig economy because he feels like the money should be better spent on, AI or something else rather than supporting the upper middle class. But nonetheless, it's actually been a driver of growth. Other companies like Shein, which makes low quality textiles, has been badly hit by the export trade war in the United States. And, so you've got areas that have been really dynamic for China that are no longer being supported by either the Chinese government or the international, countries. So it's a little difficult to see where the employment's going to go. And the official figures of something like 17% unemployment among the youth is probably woefully underreported.
Coupled with this, of course, you've seen investment in fixed assets is plummeting as well. What do you think can be done to bring in more investment, to make it more of a place to go with investment?
Well, I mean, that's the problem. I mean, EVs have been the big success story for China. They've got some amazing automobiles. But I took a ride in a car. It was kind of the Uber driver of China, and I got in. It was a nice car. It was like a Tesla, very fancy. And this guy was driving us around. I said, "Who is this company?" And he gave me the name of the company. And as I left, I said, "What did you pay for this?" And he said, "I think it was 17,000 US approximately." And then he mumbled, "But they're out of business." And I looked up the company, and it's a company that had massive subsidies, like to the tune of, several $billions. And it's now completely out of business with lots of debts, owes a huge amount of debt to all sorts of private and state-owned firms. So that even the success stories in China are littered with real problems in terms of debt. AI is where a lot of the money is going for investment. Fixed asset investment in property is not happening. And the industrial side is weak because of the export market is down. So fixed asset investment cannot be increased unless we shift to the consumption and then try to drive the domestic economy. But, that's not the way that China works. They're state driven. So I don't see any solution to this except, continued downturns. I mean, the property fixed asset investment was negative 15% in the most recent data. So it's just not looking very good.
It seems like there's a lot of next big thing in China, isn't there? We had property and now properties in the doldrums, then e-vehicles. The West was having its nose rubbed in it about e-vehicles, but we saw that that car retail sales fell over 8% in November. And then, as you say, there's so many companies doing this that, even the so-called good ones with heavy investment are failing. Do you think we're going to move on to the next? I mean, AI seems to be the current buzzword, which in some ways is more linked to consumption than it is to production because of because it's also a part of the consumer market. But then again, you also have heavy tech investment and stuff like that. Do you think that we're going to see the same approach to say the AI market as we've seen to other next big things?
Yes, we will. I mean, Xi Jinping is pushing the AI, but the problem is there's a couple of problems. First of all, the jobs are not that great for the AI revolution unless you get a huge consumer boom. I mean, we're facing the same structural issue in the United States. And second of all, tech overall, according to the official data, is about 9% of GDP, and property at its peak was something like 31% of GDP. So it's difficult to replace that. Now, the United States went through this in the 60s. We had a chip boom that was funded by the government for the space launch. But within a few short years, we had the computer revolution, and all of a sudden, all the expenditure for computers came from the consumer because we were buying Apple, Apple Macs and the rest of it. Since China has such a weak consumer market, every time you have this structural shift and you waste all this capital, which happened with railroads in the United States, which happened to some degree with, Apple Computer had a very bad period in the 90s. It's going to come off the backs of the government. So that's just going to be government debt, local government and central government debt. In the United States, that was borne by the consumer. So, they basically bought computers that no longer had much value. But China is going to be saddled as a country with this massive amount of debt, and only a portion of that money spent will be valuable. So we're already facing that with the property market. We had 20 years of a bubble, and now there's all sorts of debt throughout the system. So the same thing with the tech area. A lot of the EVs, as I just indicated, that debt is going to be borne by all these local governments, and they have no way of paying this back because they've got another growth engine. So the next revolution it's hard to see that AI is going to be that driver. Semiconductors to some degree are low end stuff. Pharmaceuticals is very strong in China because they've got a very fast pace of development. So there are some bright spots, but as a percentage of GDP, they're not that large. And so it's difficult to see how China's going to dig itself out of this hole.
Yeah, speaking of how is China going to dig its way out of this hole? At the moment, it's clearly very heavily dependent on foreign trade. And as you mentioned earlier, the tariff war has put pressure on foreign trade. So it's kind of been squeezing its neighbours in ASEAN and in Europe, indeed, to try and make up the shortfall. We're looking to another National People's Congress in March, where the next 5-year plan is going to be unrolled. What do you think? What do we expect? Any new measures? Do we expect any change, or is it just going to be this sort of grinding approach that seems to characterise the the Communist Party's approach to the economy?
Well, there's not a lot of money in the system, as I've indicated. Tax revenues are way down. So, if you try to do a consumption-led boom through tax breaks or EV subsidies, which at one point were as much as $10,000 per car, there's not a lot of room in the system for that. But they probably will tweak at the margins with some tax breaks for consumer. Second of all, obviously, she is and the leadership is hoping that AI will create some industrial-led growth, and there is some sign that in the production side, there's some developments in robots and so forth that are pretty substantial. So that will help production. But at the end of the day, there's got to be a reform that changes the nature of how money flows. Stop giving it to the big, heavy industries, the state firms that are not as profitable, and shift it to the consumer. But as a friend of mine said, who's been kicking around doing economics in China for years with the World Bank and with other organizations, China reforms only when it has to. Now, as unemployment drops, China may be forced to reform. They may be forced to cut loose some of these heavy industry, state-led investments and shift to consumption. But we're not there yet. The government still is hoping that it can pull a tech rabbit out of the hat.
So, Andrew Collier, a senior fellow at the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government at Harvard Kennedy School, and long-term China watcher and analyst and reporter and banker, and who's got such wide experience and knowledge of China. Thanks very much for joining us today with these great insights.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.